Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. This episode is a lecture that was originally recorded on Saturday, November 14th, 2015, just after 3 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, although I'm releasing it for the podcast in early December of 2015 as episode 56. This episode features a lecture titled Tips for Becoming a Better Astrologer. But since this is the first episode of December, I have a couple of announcements before we get on to our main topic. First, I've just about finished a project I started about 2 years ago to revise and expand my online course on Hellenistic astrology, and now that I'm just about finished recording the final new lecture on ancient timing techniques, I'm going to be raising the price of the course at the end of the month. People who sign up before the price increase will be grandfathered into the course and will get access to all of the new lectures, but just for a lower price than what I'll be charging for it after this month. The price increase will go into effect on January 1st, so if you've been thinking about signing up for the course for a while, you might want to do so in the next few weeks if you'd like to save some money. You can find out more information about the course on my website at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Second, I wanted to say thank you to everyone that has supported the show over the past few months by signing up to become a patron through Patreon. Thanks to you guys, I have been able to consistently produce 4 episodes a month each month since July, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without you. If you listen to the show regularly and you'd like to help support it, then please consider signing up to donate $1 or more each episode through Patreon, and in return you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, like access to our private discussion forum, early access to new episodes, and more. For more information on how to subscribe to the podcast, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. Alright, so let's get on to introducing our main topic for this episode. This was a lecture that I presented at a meeting of the local astrology group that I organize in Denver on November 14th, 2015. The talk was originally titled Tips for Learning Astrology and Becoming a Better Astrologer. The talk was motivated in part by the fact that we needed to host a meeting of our local astrology group in about a week, and I wanted to come up with a topic that would be applicable to both beginner and advanced students of astrology. The talk was also partially motivated by some issues that I've had with some of the standards in the astrological community for a while now, and my desire to raise the bar a bit. I tried to address some specific issues and areas where I feel like the astrological community sometimes comes up short, or at least where there's room for improvement, as well as just some general tips for what astrologers can do to improve their studies and practice. Only the first bit of the talk is really geared towards completely new students of astrology, while the majority of the rest of it is more applicable to those who are already a bit more advanced in their studies. That's why at this point I'm just giving the talk the title, Tips for Becoming a Better Astrologer. I should warn you ahead of time that the audio quality on this lecture is not very good, because I was trying to record it in front of a live audience at what was kind of a loud venue with a lot of noise going on in the background, and I was also using a new recorder that I hadn't used before. I'd like to thank Austin's brother, Stephen Kopic, for his help with editing the audio and trying to salvage what was a pretty terrible recording. I thought about just re-recording the lecture, but I felt like I wouldn't be able to recreate everything from the original lecture in a way that was quite as good as when I first presented it. Plus, once Stephen edited the talk, I felt like he was able to get it into a state that would suffice for general listening purposes. But just keep that in mind as you listen. So, with those general introductory remarks out of the way, let's get started with the recording of the lecture.
All right, so let's get started with our talk for today, which the title of today's talk is Tips for Learning Astrology and Becoming a Better Astrologer. Because I wanted to give a talk kind of inspired a little bit by some talks that I've seen recently and some things that I've just been thinking about over the past few years about ways that astrologers could improve what they're currently doing in areas where, as a community, as well as individuals, we can oftentimes have room for improvement, where we could kind of like raise the bar a little bit from where it's currently at in the astrological community? And what are some ways that we could go about doing that? So I've incorporated a lot of those into a series of tips that are useful both for people who are new to astrology and not very familiar with the subject in terms of starting points for what would be good to do if you're just getting into the field. But also I've tried to combine those with some tips and some guidelines and sort of advice that would be useful even for established astrologers to think about in order to improve their own practice and improve what they already do. So that's what I'm going to be presenting here today. All right. So here's my first tip. And this is a tip that I think is applicable to everybody. Established astrologers are going to already have done this to some extent, but there's actually ways that you could probably do it better. And the first tip is to build a database of charts. And when you're building a database of charts, and I'm talking about birth charts and specifically birth times, since most of Western astrology, most of the techniques of Western astrology are predicated on knowing the exact moment that a person was born. What you want to do is build up a database of timed charts. And broadly speaking, there's two groups that you want to focus on. One of them is people you know or people that you've had some contact with personally, that you have some ability to interact with personally and to ask them questions about their life. So this includes people like family members or friends, coworkers, just generally people that are in your life and in your social circle where you have the ability to directly either ask them or directly ascertain from, let's say, their birth certificate what time they were born. The other group, of course, is celebrities and public figures, which traditionally for the past 2, even 3,000 years has been a major source of research for astrologers. Astrologers for 2,000 years now have always looked at celebrity charts because sometimes celebrity charts are so paradigmatic in terms of really playing out the placements in their charts in a very literal and a very direct and sort of prominent manner. So celebrities and public figures are a good source for doing research into astrology. And one of the things that you should do is you should try to focus on celebrities that you can get an exact birth time for. And there's 2 ways to do this. One way is through Astrodatabank, which is available for free online at www.astro.com. And they have lots of free, they basically have a wiki like Wikipedia that contains pages that tells you if we have a birth time for a certain celebrity, and then it'll tell you what the source is. And they also have a rating system called the Rodin rating system that will tell you how reliable the source for the birth time is. So, for example, their top tier is AA data, which is if the birth data is from a birth certificate or some other birth record. B data, which is another tier down, is from a biography. Then it goes all the way down to D data or double D data, which is when you have conflicting birth times. So sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 different sources for a single person all saying different things, in which case you don't really have a reliable birth time at that point. So one of the things that all astrologers should do is everybody should know the Rodin rating system. Everybody should know the 5 or 6 different tiers for birth data, because generally speaking, if you ever write an article about astrology or you ever present a lecture where you use a birth chart, it's good practice to cite exactly what the source of the birth time was and how reliable it is. So that's like one little piece of information that you can do either as a new astrologer or a starting astrologer to kind of improve what we're currently doing in the astrological community just by citing our sources and making sure that we're using verified birth times for charts. Because one of the worst things or the most embarrassing things that can happen sometimes is if you're using a chart to demonstrate a technique and then it turns out that the birth time that you're using is wrong, or the birth chart that you're using is completely wrong, because then it undercuts and sort of invalidates the point that you were trying to make. So this is why building up good databases is kind of a community effort. And one of the things that you can also do is contribute to this by collecting birth times and actually submitting them to Astrodatabank yourself. So one of the things that astrologers do will sometimes be to ask celebrities or prominent figures what their birth time is. Like, for example, if you went to a political rally for your favorite politician and you got a chance to talk to him or her, You might ask them what their birth time is, and they might tell you. And if that happens in a sort of public setting, then one of the things that you can do to contribute to the broader community effort and community research is to submit that birth time to AstroDataBank. Because by doing so, you're actually helping everybody in the research efforts surrounding astrology. Finally, so that's part of the broader community effort. But in terms of the personal effort, one thing that I would recommend that everybody should do is pick a famous celebrity or a famous public figure and find somebody who you know that we have an accurate birth time for, where it's listed on astro.com or where you can otherwise get their birth certificate, and then read a biography on that person, or read 2 or 3 biographies of that person. Make that person the celebrity or the public figure that you know more about than anybody else, and use that as your main chart example. So this is something that both new astrologers can do and established astrologers can do, is that instead of just, every once in a while looking at a celebrity chart and sort of glancing at it and seeing if it confirms what your public perception of that person is through like a movie or through whatever, let's say a television commercial that you saw that person in once, instead of just sticking with the very sort of shallow level of understanding that most of us have of most celebrities and public figures, instead try to develop a very deep understanding of the history and the chronology and the personality of this person, and see how that works out in terms of their birth chart and in terms of every technique that you can possibly throw at that chart. Because by focusing on one chart very deeply, you'll actually develop a very deep and intimate understanding of not just that person's life, but also the techniques that you're working with. So one example, for example, I know somebody who they picked Albert Einstein, and they made Albert Einstein their guy because we have a birth time for Einstein, and he's also one of the most influential public figures of the 20th century. So tons of biographies have been written about him, and we know a good deal about his life. So for that reason, he makes a good figure to study. Other figures that you could study would be people like, ideally you want somebody who is either towards the end of their life so that they've done most of the stuff that they're going to do, or that their life is already over so that you know that there's nothing more to add to that necessarily. But even some living figures might still be useful, but just find somebody who has a very well-documented life and make that your personal study. Does anybody have like a figure that they've already done this with, or somebody that's like a favorite that they research? What's yours?
Errol Flynn.
Okay, who is that?
Errol.
What do they do? Or who? I'm not familiar with the name. Is that?
That's old school.
Am I showing my age?
You're showing your age.
Okay.
Or we're showing ours. We're showing ours.
Okay.
Well, his life is well documented. He was one of the first superstar Hollywood actors in the 30s.
Okay.
And died at the age of 59.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, that's a great example then. Yeah, there's tons of public figures. Over the past few years, I went out of my way to build up my own database of time charts and to write notes, not just get the birth time, but also note in your own personal files what the source of the birth time is, where you got it from, and how strong it is, because sometimes that information is relevant and will become relevant in terms of knowing how strong it is. But there's other public figures like, Arnold Schwarzenegger is one who there's been many birth biographies written about. We have birth times for Charlie Chaplin, for who was the younger girl that there was a young Hollywood actress in the 1920s and 30s that we have birth times for. We have birth times for a lot of famous public figures. So it's just a matter of finding one that really appeals to you, seeing if they have a birth time, and then using it. All right, so that's my first tip. My second tip, and this is something that many astrologers have already done, although there's also a surprising amount that haven't, which is that every astrologer should know how to read an ephemeris, but they also should have sort of like a command over the ephemeris, to the extent that, they know the ins and outs of it. They know what the current transits are. They know some of the transits over the past few decades, especially in terms of the outer planets. And they know what some of the major outer planet transits are in the coming decades. That's really useful information because in any astrological consultation, or anytime you're looking at a chart, if you can immediately, if somebody is saying, I had such and such event happened to me in the mid 1960s that really upended my life. Some astrologers that know their outer planet transits will immediately think about the Uranus-Pluto conjunction that took place in Virgo in the mid 1960s, and they might know immediately how that connects to the person's birth chart. So one of the things that I recommend that everybody should do is get a copy of the Ephemeris, get a printed copy of the Ephemeris, and just start reading it as if you would read a book, and exploring the transits and exploring the close aspects between the outer planets that take place in different decades. In doing so, you're going to put yourself in a really good position to be able to not just look at a client's chart, but even to look at your own chart and to know immediately what transits you're having at different parts of your life. So with clients, this also becomes useful in terms of if a person starts talking about, let's say, a synodic cycle. Let's say they are going through a breakup right now in their life, and they say, the last time that something like this happened to me was 8 years ago. And you would know, if you studied the Ephemeris really closely, that every 8 years, the planet Venus will go retrograde in approximately the same spot in the zodiac. So immediately, just knowing that information, you're able to connect it with that specific transit with this person's biography and know why they were experiencing that event at that specific moment in time. Whereas if you don't have the Ephemeris, let's say, memorized to some extent, you may not be sure what transit immediately was happening at that time in their life until you actually look at the charts. So getting a copy of the Ephemeris and becoming as familiar with the Ephemeris as you are with your own birth chart is a really good practice. Yeah.
There's no substitute for a paper Ephemeris because you can see years and years very quickly.
Yeah.
But there's programs I know I don't know about Android. I know for iPhone there's one called Ephemeris. That's awesome.
Okay.
I use it all the time. I mean, just for spot checking somebody's birthday or something like that. You can carry it in your pocket, and it's just I love it.
So it's like an app for the Mac?
Yeah, it's an app for iPhone.
iPhones, okay.
Yeah, and I'm probably they have the same one for Android. I don't know, but it's called Ephemeris for people with iPhones, and it's awesome. If you haven't seen it, I'll show it to you.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. So yeah, there's apps like that. There's on www.astro.com, there's a free Ephemeris for every year in every century for, I think it goes on for 3,000 years or 5,000 years or more. So you can download that for free as a PDF. Or I'd really recommend getting a print copy of the Ephemeris. The one that everybody uses is the American Ephemeris, which either does in 50 or sometimes 100-year increments. There's actually a really great one that they just released recently, which is a trans-century Ephemeris. So it gives the last 50 years of the 20th century and the first 50 years of the 21st century. So getting a copy of the Ephemeris, but also, some people, I think different people, different book lovers have different feelings towards this, but I'd even recommend maybe highlighting certain transits. When you're seeing like very important outer planet transits, to go through and use a highlighter to mark up your Ephemeris and really personalize it so that whatever transits are important to you or that you think are important outer planet transits, you can easily open up that Ephemeris and see when they're going exact and what planets are involved and so on and so forth. All right, so master the Ephemeris. This is just a picture of the Ephemeris for November, just in case there's anybody that's new and not sort of familiar with it. It's just literally a book of planetary positions of what degree of the zodiac each planet is in for any day of the year. Yeah.
And what do you use in order to print this information? Do they have telescopes that they look up in the sky and they write this stuff down?
Yeah, I mean, they're based on astronomical observations of the planets that are down to a T, but because the planetary motions are so fixed and so periodic, they know that if you look in the sky now and you figure out the speed or the velocity of each of the planets and what direction it's traveling, you can project that out for 1,000 years into the future very accurately. So with the Ephemeris, they basically do that at the time of whenever they publish it. They project out where all the planets will be on any given date and time, and then they print it out in the Ephemeris itself. And that's essentially all astrological programs are, which is going to be the next slide. Either astrological programs basically just draw on the Ephemeris. They have the Ephemeris programmed into them so that astrological programs contrary to what you might think, they're not actually calculating the live positions of the planets by observation, but it's actually by calculation based on drawing it from the ephemeris, which throws some people off or is not clear at first. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about the ephemeris?
Chris?
Yeah.
Are you also going to mention that reference book by Neil Michelson about planetary phenomena?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good one.
For that, a lot more than I need for the ephemeris.
Yeah, so Neil Michelson, who published the American Ephemeris, also published another one called, it's not Rules for Planetary Phenomena.
Like Tables of Planetary Phenomena?
Yeah, Tables for Planetary Phenomenon. And it has a bunch of specialized ephemerises that show, like, for example, it has one that shows all of the eclipses that will take place in the 20th and 21st century all on the same page, which is really useful for looking at all the eclipses in your entire lifetime at a glance. Or it shows all of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that will take place over a 1,000-year time span all on the same page. So it has a bunch of useful ones where you can take some of the basic information from the ephemeris and specify or sort of contract it down into just a few specific combinations. So yeah, that's a really great suggestion. Yeah. There's not, unfortunately. I mean, this is universal time, so that's Greenwich time. So you basically have to add whatever it is, 7 hours or something, or subtract 7 hours when you're looking at these placements, because it's starting it out at midnight. There is one that starts at noon. So there's like a noon ephemeris, so that you only have to adjust it by 3 hours. But yeah, unfortunately, they're all going to be based on universal time. But for most planets, especially outer planets, that's not going to make a huge deal because they move so slowly. It's only really the inner planets like the moon or sometimes Mercury, if it's moving really fast, that it really matters for, or it's going to make a huge difference. And for that, you should just switch to a program at that point. All right. So that's the ephemeris. And that's actually the next step. So you've mastered the ephemeris, and that's kind of like the manual version of astrology, is looking at the ephemeris and knowing how it works. That's kind of like, knowing how your car works, which, some people do and other people don't. A lot of people skip to this point. I'd recommend first learning the ephemeris, because that's sort of getting down and dirty and learning what the planetary cycles actually look like. The next step should be buying a software program. So a lot of people start with and use astro.com. You can go to www.astro.com to calculate charts for free. And that's a great starting point. It's a great point to be at initially. But one of my points here that I want to recommend is that eventually every astrologer, every astrology enthusiast should invest in a full astrology software program. So the reason for that is because are numerous. One, it allows you to build up a large database of charts, which in any online program, you're going to hit a limit at some point about how many charts you can store. Whereas for a full software program, you can build up a database of thousands or potentially, theoretically, even millions of charts. Some data collectors have actually done that and built up databases with hundreds of thousands of entries. So you can build up a huge database of charts. You can back up your charts, which you cannot do with any online programs like astro.com, which is very important in case, let's say, astro.com doesn't stick around forever. You don't want to lose all of your chart data. Yeah, I don't want to scare anybody, but I saw Joy sort of get the cold sweats when I said that. You don't want to be relying on another company. And to some extent, obviously, you're doing that even if you invest in a software program, you put all your charts in there, you're relying on them to keep it updated, but at least you can back up the charts locally on your own computer or in your own cloud, or put it on a disk drive or back it up or what have you. Additionally, allows you to customize your charts and make your own chart layouts, which you cannot do as much on any other online software program. You can also do other advanced things that are useful for research, such as searching through specific placements. So this is something that most software programs can do, but it's something that certain programs like SolarFire really specialize in, which is being able to, let's say, pull up your database of all the charts you've ever put in the database and ever saved, and then say, do a search and say, show me all charts with Mercury in Scorpio and Uranus square the moon. And it'll search through all of your charts and immediately spit out a list of all the charts that have that exact placement. That's incredibly useful if you're starting to do really advanced research in astrology and you really want to get to the bottom of some specific placements. So, for example, last year when I was putting together a lecture series on the rulers of the houses, which I presented part of earlier this year, having that database of charts made it really easy to go, show me every chart where the ruler of the 10th house is in the 7th house. And then suddenly 20 or 30 charts were spit out from the program that showed me all the different people, either that I knew in my personal life or that I knew as celebrities or public figures that had that exact placement. And then immediately you can start to see a bunch of different correlations of how that specific placement manifested in many different, but oftentimes very similar ways in different people's lives. So I think you could all understand pretty quickly how that would be a really useful feature to have for doing research. And that's something that most programs have as a feature. And finally, there's more options in the paid programs than there are in Astro.com. Because even though Astro.com and other online programs have a ton of features and offer you a ton of free stuff, there's a lot of stuff that they're still missing or that they haven't included or that they just don't include because they don't necessarily think it's important. So there's a lot of techniques, sometimes very major ones and sometimes very minor or like obscure ones that you can get by using a full-fledged software program that you can't get online. So this is primarily, I think, for newer or sort of amateur astrologers, but how many people already own like an astrology software program? Maybe half the room? Okay, so 50-50. So it's still useful. And in terms of recommendations, it does seem that at this point in time, at least, that SolarFire is the most popular astrology software program that I know of. It's in a close second place by, I think, Kepler/Sirius, which is another program that a lot of people use. On the Macintosh, there doesn't seem to have been as many programs developed, and people oftentimes will run Parallels or run a program that allows them to run Windows programs in order to run SolarFire or some other program. I know some people use I/O. Are there any other recommendations for Macintosh programs? Does anybody use a Mac and run a program? No? See, that's a big issue. Like astrologers really run into that.
It's been too long.
It's been too long?
Yeah, they need to fix that. They need to make it for the Mac.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of them, the company that makes SolarFire, tried to rectify that because they made a mobile program that you can run on phones, and they made it for the iPhone first and only recently released it for the Android like a week or two ago. So they're trying to fix that, but they're still catching up. So in the meantime, sometimes if you have a Mac, but you really want to run SolarFire, one of the things that I've recommended to people is just go to a used computer store and just buy a really cheap old laptop for like, let's say $100. And then you'll have a computer that runs Windows and you can install SolarFire on it and use your astrology program on that. So there's sort of workarounds, even if you have a Mac, but want to run SolarFire on Windows. And I guess that's another one in terms of software programs is now, I'm glad you brought that up. You can also download SolarFire or a version of it on both iPhone and Android. It's called Astro Gold, and it allows you to calculate charts just like SolarFire does on your phone. So it's actually really great. All right, so next step, and this starts to get more to things that are applicable, I think, to everybody, but especially to newer astrologers or people that are just getting into the field. One of the things that I recommend to everybody is to read as many books as you can and to read as widely as you can in as many different traditions as you possibly can. So my recommendation is basically to read as broadly as you can, and then eventually at some point you'll come to settle on or specialize in a specific tradition. But before settling down and picking a specific tradition to focus on and to become sort of your primary go-to tradition that you identify with, which most people do at some point, I'd recommend studying very broadly first. That way you can get an overview of what's available. And I recommend this because many people will typically get into astrology and they'll, just by chance, they'll stumble onto a specific book or a specific type of astrology, and that will become the one that they use sort of permanently from that point forward, just because it was the first one that they found. And sometimes that's okay, but sometimes that can be limiting because there can be other types of astrology that they would actually find really appealing or find very useful, but it was just because they've never sort of stumbled across those that they didn't really fully get into them. And in fact, sometimes people will, the longer and longer you study astrology, typically the more ingrained and the more resistant you'll tend to become to studying other traditions. So that's why I recommend, like, early on to study as broadly as you can, because then you'll have a great cross-section of what's available, and then you can choose from all of those different options at some point of something to specialize in. So in terms of print resources, there's three primarily that you should do. So one is just subscribing to TMA. And I say that not because we have copies in the back, which obviously anybody can buy, but I think everybody should subscribe to it because it's honestly the best astrological periodical that we have in the community. So there are other astrological journals and periodicals that are published by some of the major organizations like the NCGR or ESAR or other groups like that. But honestly, many of them are not very good. And the reason for that is most of the journals that are published by the astrological organizations are put together as sort of unpaid volunteer work. So as a result of that, not a lot of editorial effort or other effort goes into most journals in the astrological community, whereas TMA is actually a business that has a good group of editors and a good group of designers and graphic artists and other people that are working to make a really quality publication every month. And they publish it bi-monthly. So every 2 months, you know that you'll get another issue of TMA and that it'll have 20 or 30 pretty interesting astrological articles in it from several different astrological traditions. So subscribe to TMA because it'll give you that great cross-section of the community, but it'll also be relatively high quality compared to what else is available out there. Subscribe to TMA, check out local used bookstores. I see Paula isn't here today, but she was the former owner of one of the main metaphysical bookstores in Denver, which has just a bookshelf or two of hundreds of used astrology books. And by going to used bookstores, you can pick up so many great astrology books for almost nothing that can keep you busy for months or even years reading them. So the Metaphysical Bookstore in Denver, or Isis Books, also has some used and some new books. There's a few different choices in Colorado. And then finally, of course, you can also order a lot of books online at different online retailers like Amazon for pretty cheap. So study many different traditions of astrology, eventually settle on one, but just make sure that you've really exposed yourself to everything, because there might be something that you are interested in that you don't know about until you've forced yourself to look at. So just to give you some idea of the different traditions and types of astrology, there's, for example, modern astrology, which is the type of astrology we've practiced in the late 20th and early 21st century. There's traditional astrology, which covers basically from the 1st century all the way until the 17th century, of which there's many different subsets. There's psychological astrology, which is very good for character analysis. There's cosmobiology, which is very good for midpoints and other sort of specific planetary indicators. There's different branches of astrology. So there's natal astrology, which is the one that most of us use, but there's also electional astrology, which is selecting auspicious times to begin different ventures and undertakings. There's horary astrology, which is answering specific questions by casting a chart for the moment that the question is asked. There's synastry, which is comparing the charts of two people to see how they get along. There is mundane astrology, which is looking at how outer planet movements affect large groups of people, such as cities and nations. There's medical astrology, there's Indian astrology, and lots of other things. So this is kind of a cross-section of a number of different types and traditions and branches of astrology that I'd recommend familiarizing yourself with, because there might be one of these that you're not familiar with already that you could find very interesting if only you looked into it for a little bit. Additionally, it's important to familiarize yourself with this because sometimes a client or a person will come to you asking a certain type of question that would be really good for one of these branches of astrology, but you might not specialize in it. And at that point, it would be good to refer the person to somebody else who does specialize in that specific approach to astrology. And if you know that that type of astrology exists, then you're going to know who to refer them to. Whereas if you're not very familiar with it, you're going to have a harder time knowing what to tell the person. So are there any other major types of astrology or traditions that people can think of that I didn't include in this really brief sort of list?
Financial.
Yeah, financial astrology. What was the second one? Vocational. Okay. Esoteric. Who said that? Okay. Yeah, and esoteric is tough because there's several different types of astrology that use the term esoteric astrology. But there's the Alice Bailey School, for example, that does esoteric astrology. I think that was the big one in the 20th century. And there's a couple of others as well. So yeah, esoteric is definitely a big one.
Yeah. Weather forecasting and the Magi approach to astrology.
Sure. Yeah, weather forecasting is definitely a big one. And that's something that Paula, who I mentioned earlier, is going to give a talk on at some point here before too long. And then Magi astrology. And that's interesting because that's like a specialized sort of marketing of a type of modern astrology, which is, one person who created a school of astrology that has a specific brand or a specific name and has specific techniques that it uses. So that becomes sort of a thing in and of itself. There's actually some prominent Magi astrologers in Denver that use that. So that's a good one.
Chris?
Yeah. Relocational astrology, that's a huge one because there's a lot of specific astrologers that actually specialize in relocational astrology and astrocartography. Yeah. Transformational? Yeah, so more recently, like one of the big schools that has sort of blown up or become very popular surrounding that is evolutionary astrology. But there's also other sort of spiritual or metaphysical approaches to astrology that use that kind of language and have that kind of goal about using astrology for the purpose of self-actualization or transformation. And knowing that exists and that if somebody's looking for that and you do some other type of astrology is really important because sometimes, not every person that comes to you, let's say as a client, is necessarily going to be suited for what you're offering. And I think one of the great skills that astrologers should develop is just knowing what they have to offer and being clear about that, but also being clear when what a person who's approaching them is looking for doesn't match with their type of astrology and being able to tell them where else they should go. Yeah.
Many different traditional cultures have their own form. You've got Indian on there, you have Chinese, Mayan,
yeah.
Egyptian.
Yeah, Chinese astrology is a whole different type of astrology. Mayan astrology is a whole different type. Indian is much different. It has some relation to Western astrology and has some similarities, but it's also its own thing. And each of those also comes with its own philosophy, its own sort of philosophical and spiritual presuppositions, its own sort of cultural assumptions, as well as its own oftentimes like language and technical terminology, so that it becomes a whole thing unto itself to specialize in. But many people find that very enriching to study other traditions of astrology and either specialize in those other traditions or to take pieces from some of those traditions and incorporate those into their own practice. So there's tons of different things to study. So in terms of specific areas, there's 5 areas that every astrologer should really strive to develop in terms of their own practice and in terms of what they should have in mind about things that they should be studying. And it's not just limited to techniques. So the very first one is obviously technique. It is the real sort of basics of astrology, which is, let's say in Western astrology, we have the fourfold system, the core of the system, which is made up of the planets, the signs, the houses, and the aspects. And that's really the core of the systems. We would call those, let's say, the basic technical apparatus of astrology. And knowing how to use those is essentially knowing the basic techniques of astrology. And there's other techniques that you could learn and add on top of that, such as timing techniques like transits or progressions, or synastry, or other things like that you can sort of use to expand the technical apparatus of knowing what techniques to use in order to look at certain things. So a lot of what we've been talking about up to this point falls under the category or the rubric of technique. But there's also other issues that astrologers need to familiarize themselves with and really develop, such as, for example, what is their personal philosophy of astrology? like one's philosophy of astrology is sort of a thing unto itself in terms of what do you think when you're doing astrology and in the process of practicing astrology and the fact that it works at all, what does that mean in terms of the nature of the universe and the nature of life in general? What are some of the philosophical presumptions that you as an astrologer are making about the cosmos, either based on astrology, that the astrology is sort of eliciting from you, or that you're bringing to the table in terms of what you're not projecting onto the astrology, but what sort of philosophical presumptions you're already approaching the astrology itself with? So developing a clear understanding of your own philosophy of astrology. So for example, one of the questions that we talked about 2 meetings ago was, where do you come down on the issue of free will versus fate? Are things more fated or are they more free will? How does that play in terms of your astrology? Is your actual approach to astrology, or are the techniques that you use somehow altered or changed in some way by your personal philosophical position on fate and free will? So for example, if you believed, let's say hypothetically, that everything was predetermined, would you talk about the chart one way, versus if you thought that only some things were predetermined and that there was some element of free will, would you talk about the chart in a different way? So everybody already has their personal philosophy of astrology. So I'm not telling you to develop that, because obviously that's something that already comes as sort of inherent. But what I'm telling you to do is to think about that and to try to objectively articulate what your own personal philosophy of astrology is. And if you can't articulate it, or if you're having trouble fully articulating it, then try to read up on some different philosophical schools and some different works that have been written on the philosophy of astrology so that you can articulate what your own positions are better. So for example, if some random stranger came up to you and said, you've introduced yourself as an astrologer, and they say, "Oh, that's interesting. What do you think? Does that mean that everything in my life is predetermined?" How would you respond to that question? Or how would you answer that from a philosophical standpoint? Being able to field those sort of questions easily and in a way that's genuine and sort of just coming from your own thoughts about the world based on astrology is a really useful tool as an astrologer. So the next is history. So knowing something about the history. Oh, Joy.
I was just going to add to that. A lot of times it depends on the client too, especially I have found I've come across a few who really do believe in some kind of destiny or something. And they really want to know what that is. And I have to kind of adjust between my own approach and what the client's needs are there.
Right.
So that can become interesting.
And that's a huge issue because every client and every person will typically approach another astrologer, especially in the context of a consultation, already having their own views about what their outlook is and what their philosophy of the world is. And most times that's not necessarily going to match up with whatever the astrologer's personal views are. It's only in instances like where, for example, in evolutionary astrology, because they're so focused on specific metaphysical precepts, like that there's definitely reincarnation, that the birth chart tells you something about past lives, that when you go to somebody that says that they're an evolutionary astrologer, you have some idea of what you're getting into. But even within that field, there's a huge range of diversity in terms of the specifics of what they think. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to be able to articulate your own personal philosophy of astrology, because then you can kind of work out issues like that with clients a little bit more easily by being able to identify what approach they're coming at you with, but also to be able to sort of genuinely and authentically reflect back what your own approach is and how that either jives with theirs or doesn't in some ways. But yeah, that's a great. So for example, I think, you're referring partially to clients from India where with the cultural context of astrology and its integration into Hinduism, they'll come to astrologers with certain assumptions about what the astrologer can do for them and is capable of doing for them. Like saying, in very, no uncertain terms, will I be married or will I be successful in my career or something like that. Whereas an astrologer, let's say, that focuses more on psychology may not be comfortable attempting to make those sorts of declarations. They may be more concerned about, how the person is feeling at that point in time, or whether they're going through sort of a period that's more depressing or a period that's more positive in a sort of internal sense. That's one of the reasons why a person's philosophy and articulating it becomes important. But it also becomes important because, especially in speaking with clients, but also with speaking at the public in general, it's important to differentiate, and I'll get into this more a little later, between what the astrology itself sort of says on its own versus what your personal philosophy is and how you're interpreting that and sort of witnessing it or viewing it through the lens of your own personal belief system. Because those are not always one and the same. Sometimes there's a difference between what the astrology says and how far it goes versus where you take that based on your own personal beliefs. So that becomes relevant in consultations, and we'll sort of circle back to that. All right, so the third one is history. And I mention this because oftentimes astrologers, on the one hand, there's this dual thing that happens where astrologers like the fact that astrology is so old and so ancient because it gives it some sense of gravitas, or some sense of, having some longstanding wisdom. And sometimes they'll use that in casual conversation as proof of that astrology works or why it's legitimate, so that they'll make offhanded comments about the history of astrology. But oftentimes they don't necessarily have any real understanding of the actual history of how astrology developed, or whether the historical statement that they're making is true or something like that. I have some ideas in mind, but does anyone have any examples of things that they've heard that are sort of offhanded historical statements that astrologers sometimes make about astrology that may or may not be true? Yeah.
J.P. Morgan had a personal astrologer.
Oh yeah, so he's the one that's usually attributed the quote that said that millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. So I've never been able to validate that quote. It may have been made, but it's one of those quotes Isaac Newton was attributed that quote where he's in a fight with somebody and the guy's arguing against astrology, and supposedly Newton replies, "I've studied the subject, sir, and you have not, and therefore you don't have any position to argue about it." But it turns out that Newton never said that. So that's an issue because astrologers sometimes will throw around quotes like that from historical figures as part of the process of defending astrology, but sometimes those quotes are completely made up. And what it does is it actually undercuts your argument, especially if you find yourself in the unfortunate position of arguing with somebody that knows that you don't know what you're talking about. So one of the things that I'd really recommend is developing an understanding of the history of astrology and different periods in which it related to culture in different ways. Because by learning where astrology came from, you'll actually develop a better understanding of how to use it and not just how you're using specific techniques, but why you're using specific techniques and how they were developed. But also it'll just put you in a better position if you're trying to talk about astrology with the public, either with a client or somebody else, to actually know what you're talking about when you make a statement about where astrology came from, who used it in the past, or how it was developed. So that's very important. I'm trying to think of it. For some reason, it's escaping me at the moment. I had a whole list of sort of funny historical claims that astrologers sometimes make that some of them are true and some of them are not necessarily true, but I'm sort of blanking on them at the moment. Joy?
How about the Ophiuchus was just recently discovered?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. So that's an example of one that's a historical argument that's being made by skeptics against astrologers. And it's completely, anybody that's studied the history of astronomy or the history of astrology knows that it's completely baseless, because astrologers have known about precession for 2,000 years. But the news headlines in 2011 that came out, January or February of 2011, were, new phenomenon of precession recently discovered, zodiac completely different as a result of that. And it was a complete lie. And any astrologer who had studied the history of astrology knew immediately how to respond to that sort of accusation. So that's another good example of not just astrologers saying things that are historically false, but also sometimes either the public
or people that are antagonistic against astrology, like skeptics, attempting to use history against astrologers, but not necessarily knowing what they're talking about. So we're studying all these different areas because one of my primary points here is that it's important to know what you're talking about and to think about things deeply and sort of thoroughly rather than just having a very sort of shallow or passing knowledge of certain things, like throwing out quotes or what have you. Okay, the fourth area is, I had a hard time labeling this or figuring out what the term should be, but it's professionalism / application. So everybody knows everybody, once you get past a certain point, knows the basic techniques of astrology, but there's this whole separate area of how to actually practice it within a professional setting. And while not everybody is necessarily a practicing professional astrologer that does astrology full time, everybody does from time to time read the chart of another person who's a friend or a family member or somebody in their social circle. And in that context, you're actually taking on the role of a professional astrologer, even if that's not your primary vocation. And so once you put yourself in that role, and just about everybody does it at some point, you have to be conscientious of certain things that you're doing in order to convey the right image, since you're actually representing the entire field when you do that. Every time you read somebody's chart, they're going to then walk away from it with an impression about what all astrologers are like or what all astrologers do. So there's certain things that you want to make sure you're doing and certain attitudes and postures that you want to make sure that you're adopting when you're doing that in order to convey the right impression. So we don't have to run through what all of those are right now, but just being able to field certain questions about the philosophy of astrology or the history of astrology, or to talk coherently about the techniques, are a really great starting point in terms of being sort of good as a professional if you're talking about a person's chart. There's other professionalism things as well, and this gets into the fifth point, which is ethics, which are, what are the ethics of astrology, or are there certain ethical guidelines or, let's say, boundaries that a person shouldn't cross when they're practicing astrology? And here we get into a little bit of a murky area because different people have different views about what they think is ethical or not ethical when it comes to practicing astrology. So, for example, I recently read that there's a group, the main astrological organization in France is primarily headed by psychological astrologers. And in their ethics guidelines, they say that one of their basic tenets and rules for being a part of their organization is that astrology cannot be used to predict anything. So it can only be used as a descriptive tool to talk about things that are currently going on in the present or things that have occurred in the past, but you're not allowed to make statements about what will happen in the future. So from their vantage point, they're trying to avoid doing what they view as psychological harm to individuals who may receive a prediction negatively, or they might not view prediction as possible. They may think that astrology is only descriptive and that it's not possible to do prediction. There's some astrologers that believe that. So the point of that was not necessarily to either adopt that or to mock that model, but just to say that different astrologers have different beliefs about the ethics surrounding astrology and how it should be used versus how it shouldn't be used. And one of the things that it's important for each person to do as part of developing your personal philosophy, from point number 2, is to also develop sort of like an ethical guide of what you think should be done with astrology versus what you think shouldn't be done. And to talk about that with other people to get a sense for how your personal sense of ethics with astrology does or does not mesh well with other people, and to maybe modify your own viewpoint or maybe further embrace your own viewpoint more based on those comparisons. So there's lots of different ethical issues that come up when you're practicing astrology. So for example, one of them is different astrologers have different opinions about whether you should read the charts of children to their parents. So let's say you have a newborn, they were just born like yesterday, and you sit down with the parent and you're having coffee with them and they say, here's my child's chart, tell me about their future, or tell me what type of person they'll be. Would you do that for them versus would you say, no, I can't do that? Different astrologers actually have different opinions about whether they would do that at all or to what extent they would make statements about the person's life. So that's an example of what I would say is a valid ethical argument that astrologers have, because different astrologers come down on different sides of it. It's easy to see how you could go one way or another because there's sort of pros and cons for both sides, let's say. Can anyone else think of any other like ethical arguments that are either good ones that astrologers have or ones that we might have perhaps?
Clients present charts of their significant other without permission.
Yeah, that's a huge one. And that's actually one that's important because that's actually explicitly forbidden in the ethical guidelines that were adopted by the NCGR and ESAR about a decade ago. About 10 or 15 years ago, all of the big astrological organizations got on this kick about developing ethical guidelines, and they all developed them for all of their members to follow. And that was one of them that they adopted from psychology and counseling, which was that technically, if you're in a consultation, you're only allowed to read the chart of the person who's directly in front of you. And if somebody brings in another chart from somewhere else, then you actually have to get permission from that other person to read their chart. So that's actually another one of those ones where people, astrologers, and this was hotly debated at the time, whether that's a valid rule and whether everyone wants to follow that. And you can kind of see the sort of pros and cons for both sides. Did you have another one?
Time and circumstances of death.
Sure. Yeah. Whether death can be predicted, and if it can be predicted, whether you should attempt to predict a person's death. And that one's funny because it's another one of those ones where even though you wouldn't expect it, you can actually argue both sides. So most people would say immediately, like, no, of course you shouldn't predict a person's death because that sounds kind of weird and what's the use in that? But there was actually somebody, I think it was Deborah Holding, that argued this recently. She said, I had somebody who was like in hospice and they were like terminal and they did not have long to live, but they just wanted to have some general idea of how much longer they might make it because there were certain things that they were trying to do and prioritize before they died. And they actually had a good reason to at least attempt to know, even if they understood that the astrologer might not be able to get it down perfectly, that they wanted to at least attempt to get some idea. And so she made that as sort of a counter argument to what some people otherwise might say, of course we should have a blanket argument against predicting death because certainly there's no circumstances in which that would be appropriate. And it's like sometimes you run into certain instances where there might be instances where hypothetically it could be. And I think that was an actual case. But so most ethical issues, and this is what makes them frustrating, is that there might be pros and cons to either side. But that's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to think about those ahead of time, because they might affect how you practice astrology and how you might deal with certain situations that you might not expect when you come to them.
Another big one would be a client asking you to make a decision for them. Well, you're looking at the chart and the transits, and should I do this or not do this?
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, and that's a huge one that astrologers are very often met with. And that becomes even more of an issue because, for example, there's some astrologers, like if you're doing psychological astrology that's purely descriptive about a person's sort of internal psychological state, they may not feel like that's a good use of astrology at all to attempt to tell a person what choice they should make. Whereas there's other astrologers, like let's say that do electional astrology, where if a client came to them and said, I want to get married on this date or this date, then the astrologer is necessarily in some sense making a choice for them by saying that you should get married on Tuesday rather than Wednesday. So again, with that, there's different scenarios in which astrologers get put in different positions about whether they should make choices for people or whether they shouldn't. And yeah, there's all sorts of nuances surrounding that. All right, so these are the 5 primary areas that every astrologer has to develop some understanding of. And I hope I've outlined a few specific reasons why you might want to think about developing some of these areas for yourself personally. So that leads me to my next point, and this is sort of goes along with the last one, which is one of the underlying things I really want to emphasize that I sometimes see as like an issue in the astrological community is settling for sort of a shallow understanding of certain topics or certain areas.
And one of the things I really want to recommend is to not settle for a shallow understanding of especially specific areas that you have some interest in or in which you purport to have some knowledge of, but instead try to study things deeply. So once you've studied all of the different traditions of astrology, or let's say you've studied a bunch of different traditions and a bunch of different approaches, and you've settled on one that really speaks to you, at that point, I would really recommend studying that approach as deeply as you possibly can and taking it as far as you can so that you become an expert or a specialist in that specific area. So if there's something that you don't understand, then research it as much as you possibly can until you actually understand it. You can speak about it with some authority. So what I mean by that is, like I said earlier, if you're going to make statements about the history of astrology, then you better know something about the history of astrology, or at least have some general, that you've actually spent some time studying it before you start making statements about, such and such, that, like, let's say that astrology has been practiced for 10,000 years. There's some astrologers that claim that, and it's not true in the sense that they sometimes claim it. So before you make statements about the history of astrology, make sure that you've studied at least some of the history of astrology, that you've read a book or two, let's say at the very least, on the history of astrology before purporting to make statements about it or claiming to make statements about it. If you're going to make statements about science or mathematics, let's say quantum mechanics, then you better have some understanding of quantum mechanics, because that's another area where oftentimes astrologers will throw out statements about quantum mechanics that they've heard, and they'll use them against skeptics, but the skeptics themselves will, especially if they have an understanding of quantum mechanics, will understand that that's not an accurate statement on the astrologer's part, and it undercuts what the astrologer is saying. So that was something I ran into, where I ran into a skeptic who, that was one of his main objections to astrology, is that every time he would run into an astrologer, they would say something trying to connect astrology with quantum mechanics, but it was clear that they didn't really understand quantum mechanics at all. And this was a person who had just finished his PhD in quantum mechanics. So that's one of the things that you should sort of consider. I don't want to say every time, because I don't want to make people paranoid, but before you make sort of sweeping statements or generalizations, imagine that you're talking to somebody who has a PhD in the subject that you're talking about, and how it would be perceived if you made a statement about it with very little knowledge of that field. So if the answer is that it probably would not be a good statement or would not be received well because they would immediately recognize that you don't know what you're talking about, then sometimes it's better just to not make the statement rather than go out on a limb. Does everyone sort of get that, or does anybody have a major objection to that? I mean, it's sort of it doesn't seem like it's sort of a common wisdom sort of thing to know what you're talking about, but sometimes it's an easy trap to fall into, to want to make statements that sound good, even if you don't fully if you're not an expert in that field. I guess I would just try to encourage people to recognize their own limitations and to be more cautious when making sweeping generalizations about different fields, because sometimes that can look not very good. All right. And that leads us to our next point, which is know your own limitations. So even though my first piece of advice was to study as widely and as broadly as you can, and to try and study just about every tradition and every approach to astrology, at least a little bit, ultimately you can't master everything. And specifically, you can't master every tradition. There's too much astrology, and astrology has existed for far too long and is far too broad to actually master every approach. So that's not possible. Therefore, that's when you should get a broad overview of everything, then become a specialist in a specific approach or tradition. But once you've done that, even once you've specialized in a certain tradition, most fields even, or most approaches to astrology, are still too broad to fully master so that you could use every technique within that field at all times. So this is where you need to realize that you can't use every technique in every chart that you look at. And if you attempt to, then you're actually going to be making things harder for yourself and making things more muddy and unclear, then you are going to be improving everything. So people sometimes have this perception that the more techniques you use, the better an astrologer you are, or the more things that you throw into the chart, the more variables that you throw into a chart, the more accurate your reading is going to be. But in fact, oftentimes it's the reverse. The more points and the more variables and the more things that a person puts into a chart, the blurrier the picture becomes, because they're trying to sort of do everything, and in the end, they end up doing nothing. So what I would recommend instead is specialize in specific techniques. So find a few specific techniques that really speak to you, and then study those techniques as far as you possibly can. Take them as far as you can possibly go with them. So take, let's say, the biography that you picked out of that specific person, where you read about their entire life in several different biographies, and apply those, like, let's say 2 or 3 techniques to the person's entire life. So let's say if the technique that you really want to specialize in is secondary progressions, then do the secondary progressions for the entire life of that person and get a sense for how that technique played out for the entirety of that person's life. So this is true both about timing techniques. I especially mean this in terms of timing techniques, but it's also true in terms of specific chart placements. Everybody has to draw the line at some point in terms of the number of significators that they want to place into a chart. So, for example, some people, let's say astrologers in India or some traditional astrologers draw the line at the 7 visible planets. And they say that that's enough information, that they get enough just from those 7 basic placements and all of the ways that they can be configured in different signs and different houses and different aspects, which is hundreds or perhaps thousands of different positions just on their own with the 7 visible planets, that's sufficient. There's other astrologers, for example, let's say up to the late 20th century, that said that all of the planets up through Pluto, so that's 9 or 10 planets, that's sufficient, that using all of those significators in the houses with aspects, in the signs, that's a sufficient number of indicators for them, and they would draw the line there. Then there were some astrologers that came in and said that we should use the asteroids. So Demetra George, for example, she says that you can use at least a core group of asteroids, and those are the primary ones that she'll use in every chart reading. But then there's all sorts of other things. There's midpoints, of which there's hundreds or thousands of. There's Arabic parts, which there's hundreds of. There's fixed stars, which there's hundreds or thousands of. There's, in Uranian astrology, there's hypothetical planets. There's now a bunch of new, minor planetary bodies out past Pluto that are now being discovered at a very alarming rate. We've got a ton of them at this point. There's even black holes and like nebulas and different galaxies and stuff that some people are using and putting into charts. So one of the problems is that there's like diminishing returns at some point once you start integrating all of this stuff, because at some point the entire chart just becomes one huge blob that has literally millions of significators in it that you'll never be able to take into account. Even if you lived for 1,000 years, just looking at one chart, you still couldn't take all these chart placements into account. So the question is where to draw the line. And I don't think, I'm not going to tell you where you should draw the line, because I think where each person draws the line is sort of personal to them and special to them. And there's different astrologers and different traditions that are going to draw that in different places, and that's fine. But I will just say that I think each person should think about drawing that line at a specific place that's closer than maybe when they initially studied many different traditions, to narrow it down to the things that work the most and that work the most reliably, and to stick with that and not worry about everything else that's going on. So to realize your limitations in terms of your ability to take into account only a certain number of significators in any chart that you look at, and realize that that's okay, that it's okay to draw the line at some point, even if you didn't incorporate, what I wrote, like Quasar 49203-139-A6.
that, the planet Mercury, let's say, this planet that's in our solar system, that's a couple planets away, is more important, I would make an argument, than some quasar or some asteroid or black hole that's 47 light years away. It's okay to make distinctions like that. And I think it's important for astrologers, now that we have this overabundance of different significators, to start making distinctions like that about what's more important versus what's less important. So in other words, to start prioritizing what's important to you in chart readings versus what's less important, and to focus on the important things more. So the last point was to focus on your own limitations, but there's also this other side of the coin, which is, what are the limitations of astrology? And in what ways should you be mindful of those limitations? So, astrology can do a lot of things. One of the things that I think is interesting, when I came into the field, I actually expected astrology to be able to do a lot more than it can. And I think if most people think back to when you first got into the field, of what the public perception of astrology is, or what you would assume it to be based on, let's say, the depictions of astrologers in like newspapers or magazines or movies or things like that, that sometimes you'll get this romanticized version of what an astrologer is and what they can do, where it's almost like they have like a crystal ball and they can literally look into the future and describe perfectly what's going to happen in somebody's life, let's say 46 years from now. So there may be some elements of that astrologers can do, but I think generally speaking, everyone in this room understands that that's not quite how astrology works, and that astrology is a bit more limited in that because it doesn't provide omniscience. It does not make it so that a person knows literally everything about the future or everything that will take place in a person's life just by glancing at their birth chart. It can tell you a lot of things. You can actually do a lot of really weird things that you shouldn't otherwise be able to do with astrology, but it doesn't make you an all-knowing sort of godlike figure, I think, unless anyone else has had that experience of, no? Okay. So given that sort of realization, that realization is really important, because identifying astrology's limitations is something that we don't always necessarily think about, or we don't always focus on a lot. But once we do that, once we work out the bounds of what's possible with astrology, then you can actually focus on what it can do and what astrologers are capable of, and then doing that really well. So there's different types of astrology, and there's different applications that are better or worse for certain things. So, for example, a psychological astrologer would be really good at looking at a person's chart and talking about the person's psyche and their internal dispositions and their character traits, and whether a person would be more prone to depression or more prone to sort of angry fits or things like that. They could be really good at that, but they're going to have certain limitations where a psychological astrologer is not going to be as good about predicting events, let's say, or saying that a person would have an important relationship come up next year, or that there might be a change in their home and living situation in 2019 or something like that. So predicting events. Conversely, a predictive astrologer might be really good at predicting events that will happen in a person's life and saying, that you're going to get married at the age of 46. But they aren't going to necessarily be as good at character analysis. So their limitation is that they're not very good at psychological astrology, even if they can predict events. Every tradition and type of astrology has this same kind of limitation, where there's something that it can do really well and it's really well suited for, and there's other things that it cannot do very well, or it's just not very well suited for. So once you've come to specialize in a specific approach to astrology in a specific tradition or branch, it's good to identify what things you can do really well with that versus what things you can't do, and to be kind of okay with those limitations rather than to overreach. Because astrologers sometimes get into trouble when they don't specialize in a specific approach or a specific tradition, but they try to sort of cobble together an approach to sort of barely allow them to do that. So, for example, like a psychological astrologer, or somebody that doesn't
that just reads a person's character or psyche, and then a client comes in and says, tell me when I'm going to be married. And they look at the chart sort of frantically trying to figure out, how they would answer that from the perspective of their system. And they may or may not do a very good job. Part of the thing I want to sort of remind astrologers is that you don't necessarily have to do all things. You just have to specialize in what your specific approach or type of astrology is, and then be very clear about what that is and what its limitations are, both to yourself as well as to your clients. Okay, so I think that's that point. And finally, this ties in with something that I sort of ran into recently due to another lecture that I attended, which is one of the realizations I think that people have, especially if you study the history of astrology, is you very quickly realize that people from a multitude of different backgrounds use astrology, and that astrology doesn't inherently have any specific preference or bias towards any particular political or religious or metaphysical or cultural standard. That astrology itself is neutral, and that there's many different people from different cultures and different time frames with different religious and political backgrounds that all use astrology. So, for example, at this point in time, like let's say in this country, especially after like the 60s and 70s, astrology became very much aligned, or there was a lot of people that we would, let's say politically, would say a lot of liberals used astrology. But then many of those people then assume that astrology is like, let's say, a liberal or a democratic thing. But then we have just 20 years ago or 30 years ago, a president of the United States, we had Ronald Reagan using astrology as part of his campaign effort in order to get elected. So he used electional astrology in order to time when to launch both of his campaigns. So part of the point there is that astrology itself isn't inherently, it doesn't have any inherent political affiliation. And part of the reason for saying that is that therefore astrologers should be careful about either assuming that it does or telling other people that it justifies by using astrology to justify whatever their own political belief is or whatever their own spiritual or philosophical or metaphysical belief is. So generally speaking, people will bring to astrology their own political beliefs and their own spiritual and philosophical beliefs, and then they will practice it within that context. And that's okay. And everybody does that. And astrology has always been culturally relative in that way. But there just has to be this realization that there may be other ways of doing it or other ways of looking at it. So there should be some trepidation for people if they have an inclination towards thinking that their way of doing it is the only way. So I think this is important because people oftentimes confuse the two. They confuse their own views about politics or philosophy or religion and how they interpret astrology through that lens with what's sort of objectively true. But also people will sometimes give a lecture or a presentation or even a consultation in which they'll try and make it seem like the astrology is doing or saying something that objectively confirms or affirms their own political or philosophical or spiritual view. And while I have some sympathy with that because astrology has often been practiced in some sort of philosophical or spiritual or religious context, there's also a problem with that because what everybody should do basically is imagine, you have your own political and philosophical and religious, let's say spiritual or philosophical views, and you're practicing astrology within that context, and you think astrology speaks to that. But imagine somebody that has, let's say, the diametrically opposite political or religious views from you, and imagine them using astrology to legitimize and saying that the astrology legitimizes their views. And imagine how you would feel sort of observing somebody doing that. And that should, I think, for most people, it evokes some sense of like, well, that would be kind of weird, or that would be kind of odd for somebody to do that, because I don't necessarily think the astrology does confirm their whatever views. So one of the things that I wanted to say is just be careful about and try not to use astrology to justify your own beliefs, whatever those are. Now, you can still draw conclusions from astrology. You can still bring your own philosophy and spiritual and political views to the table. And you can still acknowledge that you're looking at the astrology through that context, but it's just very important to be careful about confusing the two, because sometimes astrologers can get into trouble and can kind of go astray when that happens. Does anyone have any objections to that? That one's a little still in process of how to like phrase that specific one, because it's a very touchy issue, because astrology is often so culturally relative, and it's often practiced within the context of what a person's views are. And it's always been that way. So, 2000 years ago, it's like we have that story in the Bible about the three magi going to see Jesus, and that there was a big star that occurred at the moment of his birth, or that there was some auspicious thing. And that story is in the Bible partially because it legitimizes their belief that the Messiah had just been born. Or a few centuries later, there were stories about Muhammad being born, and about a big alignment of planets taking place when he became the prophet. Lots of different religious sort of groups or philosophical groups have used astrology in different ways to legitimize their belief, or have incorporated the astrology into their belief system. But it's just, I think, important for astrologers to be, as much as we can, very careful about how we frame that, even if we're incorporating it into our personal philosophical views. Next, and this is sort of getting towards the end, but one of the things I really want to recommend to people is to take critiques seriously. Something I've observed a lot in the last few years in the astrological community is that skeptical critiques of astrology are often dismissed or written off as not valid, or as not even worth considering or thinking about very deeply, because they're coming from an antagonistic position or an antagonistic place. So, and that's often true, where skeptics do approach critiques of astrology from an antagonistic place and not really from a place of understanding. That's actually one of the shortcomings that I've observed, because I've actually been following it and studying the work of skeptics. And I actually attended a skeptic conference in Boulder just a few years ago, because there was going to be a presentation on astrology, and I wanted to see what they said. So one of the things that I've observed about the skeptical movement is that oftentimes skeptics will make statements about subjects that they haven't studied very much. So they'll make very shallow sort of criticisms that look plausible or make sense on the surface if you don't know very much about the subject. But if you do know a lot about the subject, then you realize that their criticisms are not very well founded. So astrologers oftentimes do the same thing in reverse in rejecting the criticisms, but we actually have an opportunity to do better than the skeptics do. And all we have to do in order to accomplish that is take the step that they don't, which is actually and honestly studying their criticisms carefully and taking them into account and thinking about them deeply, rather than just on some shallow or some sort of surface level. So study the work of skeptics, study the work of criticisms and attacks on astrology, get to know what their objections were, weigh the available evidence that's presented in the articles, and determine or develop an understanding of what parts of their arguments had some validity versus what parts of their arguments didn't. Sometimes the arguments that they make do have some validity. There are some criticisms of astrology that are worthwhile criticisms that we have to take into account and incorporate into our body of knowledge about shortcomings that astrologers or that astrology has. However, that's not true with all of them. There are some arguments, like the precession argument that was mentioned earlier, which when they make an argument that astrologers don't know about precession and are using the tropical zodiac on accident, that's just simply not true. And that's an argument that we can easily dismiss or dispute. But there's other arguments that may not be so easy to dispute and that represent actual shortcomings in the astrological community. But instead of viewing these as areas where we're just defeated or something like that, or that disproves astrology, instead, most of them represent areas where there's room for improvement. So we should take the skeptical critiques of astrology seriously, because oftentimes they represent areas where there are this room for improvement. So one of the things I'd recommend that everybody do is develop a set of answers of what your personal answers would be to common criticisms of astrology.
So, for example, there's a list that's been floating around since the 1980s. It was put forward by an astronomer, and it's like a list of 10 or more skeptical questions that are supposed to be critiques of astrology posed to astrologers that astrologers aren't supposed to be able to answer. So I would recommend going out and searching for articles like that and searching for those types of criticisms and reading the questions and then thinking about how you would answer that question if you ran into a person someday who asked you it in a public setting and what kind of response you would give to that person. So think about what not just the best and most accurate response would be, but also how you would present it in a sympathetic manner. Because it's not necessarily always enough to be right, but sometimes you have to actually present your arguments in a way that's compelling and in a way that's sort of compassionate and not defensive. Because even if you're right and you just respond, well, of course astrologers have known about precession for 2,000 years, and then you say, you idiot, that immediately, sort of, it doesn't invalidate your point. You might still be right, but you've kind of lost the argument because you've defaulted to being defensive rather than just simply speaking from the point of view of somebody that knows more about the subject than his or her opponent. So these are important so that astrologers can both respond to and field questions from skeptics, but also from the public and from just random people, just normal people that don't know much about astrology. Because unfortunately, one of the things that's happening right now is that astrologers are losing the culture war against skeptics who are against astrology. And this is happening through events like the 2011 Zodiac controversy, where you have all of the newspapers and news websites in the country printing, headlines saying, precession recently discovered, new zodiac sign, Ophiuchus, comes into play. All astrologers were wrong for the past 2,000 years. There's a lot of people, I've noticed especially a lot of younger people that are in their teens or 20s that remember that controversy, but all they really remember about it was the headline that all of the astrologers were wrong and the zodiac changed. So being able to answer that question, if you walked up to somebody someday who's like, let's say 20, and you said, I'm an astrologer, they asked you what you do, and you said, I'm an astrologer, and they said, well, didn't the zodiac change a few years ago or something like that? And being able to respond to that question is actually a really important thing that I think every astrologer should be able to do, partially because it means that you have some basic fundamental understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it when it comes to astrology. All right. So does anyone have any points or questions or objections about that when it comes to skeptical critiques? All right. Only a couple more points here. One of them, the next one is to strive to develop a better understanding of astrology's place in society. So this is actually tied in with the last point about being able to field skeptical critiques and understand what the criticisms of astrology is. The next step after that, once you've understood what the objections to astrology are, is the next step is to actually develop a clearer understanding of where astrology sits right now at this point in time relative to the broader culture that we're practicing it in. So what I mean by that is that sometimes astrologers, they'll get into astrology and it becomes like this bubble where we're all in the same community and we'll go to the same meetings and the same conferences and we'll have other friends that are in astrology and we'll tend to associate with them. And that leads to this sense of like normalization of like, yeah, this is a valid thing and we're all practicing it and we all know that there's something useful to it. And eventually, everybody else in society will either accept that at some point or that, they're just, remaining ignorant and eventually they'll catch on. But at some point, like astrology will become accepted everywhere if it's not already. Some people believe they'll get in certain like cultural bubbles, especially I've noticed like certain cities on the West Coast where people tend to be more like open to astrology or open to new age things, that sometimes you'll end up in this situation where people, because everybody they know thinks that astrology is a valid thing, they'll think that like everybody in the world thinks that astrology is valid, except for some small pockets of, let's say, resistance.
But in point of fact, like one of the things that most astrologers don't realize is that the majority of the world does not believe that astrology is a legitimate phenomenon. Most recent polls show that only about 25% of the population, at least in the US, views astrology as a legitimate phenomenon. And that's very broad. Like that may be just a sampling of people that thinks that sun signs or that the zodiac column represents something real. But that means that 75% of the population thinks that what astrologers are doing is false. So that's a huge a sort of cross-section of the population, and that's really important to know. The other problem is that astrologers run into two issues where they've always historically, or at least in the past 200 years, had issues both with the scientific community, where astrology has never been validated and therefore is not seen as valid, but also religious objections to astrology, where there's actually a large segment of the population that's out there that believes that astrology is a legitimate phenomenon, but thinks that it's the work of the devil. So you get this other aspect of it where some portion of that 25% of people, supposedly of the population that believes in astrology, they believe that it's real, but they don't necessarily think it's like a good, legitimate phenomenon that's happening. They think that there's bad things with like black magic being practiced by people in like secret societies wearing black cloaks. So one of the things that astrologers need to do is really strive to understand where astrology sits in society right now relative to science, like understanding what astrology's place in society is right now relative to science, which is frankly not very good. There were some studies that were done. The best ones, like the one that got the closest to validating astrology, was called The Mars Effect by Michelle Gauquelin. And even that one was hotly disputed. So even though it seemed to show some slight statistical indication that people that were born with Mars either rising over the ascendant or culminating at the midheaven tended to become eminent athletes more often than other people, even that one finding was hotly disputed and is still not accepted in scientific circles to this day, which means that there's literally no strong scientific evidence at this current point in time that indicates that astrology is a valid phenomenon. So astrologers need to recognize that and understand that, but then understand what that means for the practice of astrology in the broader world. That if astrology hasn't been validated yet, then that means that we run into certain obstacles in the broader sort of society that we're attempting to practice it in, which is that sometimes we can run into issues with laws against astrology. We can run into issues with academia, for example. There was a school, Kepler College, attempted to get accreditation to give accredited degrees in astrological studies in the state of Washington, and they were able to get state accreditation, but they could never get national accreditation, which meant that the degrees virtually didn't mean anything. And sometimes astrologers, this is an issue I'm bringing up because sometimes astrologers don't understand what we're up against in terms of the broader acceptance of astrology in society, and that we still have a lot of work to do. So my point is not to like depress people or say that, astrology is never going to be accepted or it's always going to be marginalized in this way. But the point is actually to say that we actually have a lot of work to do, but that we could make a lot of progress if we were more realistic about where astrology is at this point in time. And that's only going to happen if we recognize what its current place in society is. So my advice is to try and develop a realistic and pragmatic view of where astrology is at in the present. I'm constantly running into issues where astrologers have not done this because they believe in it as legitimate phenomena and therefore just assume that either it's like a conspiracy to keep it down or that other sort of things are conspiring to make it so that it's not accepted. Sometimes that's the case. Most of the time, that's not the case. It's oftentimes just that astrologers themselves haven't raised the bar enough to do what's necessary to take astrology to the next level and to make it validated in our society and in our culture. So that doesn't mean that that's not possible. It just means that we have a lot of work to do. And that's why I wanted to give this talk in order to give some tips for things that we can do to raise the bar on what we're currently doing, which could eventually lead to greater acceptance of astrology in society. So And finally, understanding this will help us to counteract negative preconceptions, because if you understand where somebody who doesn't believe in astrology is coming from, then it's much easier to talk to them and to present astrology in a way that might be palpable or understandable to that person. All right. And finally, the last point I wanted to make, and this sort of just summarizes a lot of the points here, but just understanding the whys is the last point that I wanted to make to sort of wrap this up. So it's not enough just to do astrology. All of us do astrology, and there's lots of people that do it, that practice the techniques. So the very first sort of point that I mentioned earlier, but not a lot of people understand why they're doing certain things or where those techniques come from. They stick with the first level of just studying many different techniques without necessarily going the next step and figuring out why they're doing it and developing a really well-rounded understanding of the history and the philosophy and the ethics and everything else that's related to astrology. Because there's so many different fields that tie into astrology in different ways, as I've talked about up to this point. So what I want everyone to do is just try to understand why we're doing what we're doing as much as you possibly can. So for example, if you use a specific form of house division, if you use, let's say, Placidus houses or Porphyry houses, you should understand why you're using that specific form of house division over some other form of house division. And if somebody asks you, why are you using that form of house division, you should have a pretty good answer to why you chose that specific one that hopefully does not rely on just saying, that's what I started with, which is most people's answer. So it's okay if that's your answer right now, but in the long term, it would be good if you could develop an answer that actually had a specific conceptual or practical or theoretical motivation, so that you could say, I use Porphyry houses, and it was first introduced by an astrologer in the 3rd century, and I like it because it divides the space between the midheaven and the ascendant proportionally, because I think each of the houses should have approximately the same space on both sides of, let's say, the quadrants, or some idea like that, so that it's not just something that you're receiving as a sort of received tradition, but instead you have specific historical and conceptual and practical reasons for doing what you're doing. Additionally, you should think about whether your motivation for using certain techniques is conceptual or whether it's empirical. Astrologers draw on both when they're using certain techniques or certain aspects of astrology. So, for example, Uranus is a good example of that. So with Uranus, it was a planet that was only discovered a few centuries ago. And we have stories about, on the one hand, how astrologers developed their understanding of what Uranus meant empirically. But on the other hand, we also have stories about how Uranus developed our understanding of it sort of conceptually or theoretically, philosophically. So on the one hand, we have this story about John Varley, who was this astrologer in the 18th century, who he kept looking at Uranus in charts over and over again. He kept looking at it both in the natal chart and especially in its transits. And he kept noticing specific unexpected sort of disruptions and disruptive things happening every time Uranus hit this certain part of both his chart as well as other people's charts. And one day he calculated that Uranus was going to hit this specific spot in his chart, and he decided he was going to stay in that day and sort of like shut himself into his house so that nothing bad would happen until the appointed time when the transit had passed. And so he did this, and then just a few minutes after the transit passed, he hears this loud commotion coming from outside his house. And he goes outside and then sees that his house is caught on fire, and there's a bunch of people running around that are trying to get water to put out the fire. And John Varley sits down, and he's so excited that he starts writing in his notebook his new discovery that he's been able to confirm this sort of empirical observation about what this new planet means, and that he was right in his prediction that something like that would happen. And his son, who's narrating this story, is just absolutely disgusted because he sits down and writes it down as his house is burning down to the ground because he's so excited about this discovery. So that's an example of astrologers developing an idea of something by observing it and taking notes and seeing what it does over a long period of time, which is the empirical approach. The other approach is that sometimes astrologers will look at what things mean symbolically or sort of philosophically and then draw conclusions about it from that.
So, for example, one of the things that astrologers developed a meaning for Uranus is that it's kind of like an oddball planet, and that people with a prominent Uranus are kind of weird or eccentric in some way. And it turns out that the planet Uranus, if you actually look at it through a telescope, is one of the only planets that rotates on its side. So it's like a weird sort of eccentric planet that has this sort of weird orbit just all on its own. And that in and of itself, if you looked at it and said, because Uranus orbits on its side and it's the only planet to do that, that means it represents symbolically something that is eccentric or is out of the ordinary. And therefore, when Uranus is prominent in somebody's chart, it must also mean that there's something eccentric or out of the ordinary about that person. So that's the type of logic, symbolic logic, that astrologers sometimes use to derive significations. And it's important for you to understand which of the two you're drawing on when you're making statements about certain placements in your chart, because it may be one or the other or both. But if it's none of those, then you actually have a problem, because then you don't know when or where the meanings are coming from. So try and develop it based on one of those. Okay, and once you've done that, you will have understood the whys. So that's really the final point, which is just understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, where it's coming from, and to be able to talk sort of fluently about that to people that don't know anything about what you're talking about. And if you can do that, then I think all of us will be able to raise the position of astrology in society sufficiently so that astrology can sort of reclaim a more acceptable place in society where it's not looked down on as much as it is today. And I think as astrologers, as people that practice astrology and think that there's some validity to it, that's something that each of us should aspire to. So these are some tips and sort of guides that I would give you for how to accomplish that by improving your own practice. I'm sure there's a lot of other tips and a lot of things that we could add to this, and I'd love to have that start sort of a conversation first amongst us in this group, but then eventually in the broader astrological community about how to move astrology forward and how to take us, into the 21st century by doing it better than what we received. Because that's what every astrological generation does. We always receive the tradition, we see everything that they've been doing for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, and we adopt those techniques, but then we move it one step forward. So these are some of the steps that I think we can take to take that next step forward. And in doing so, I think astrology will look a lot different 100 years from now than it does today. But if we do a good job, hopefully it will look much better. All right. So I think that's it. Does anyone have any questions or comments? All right. No? Okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't see it.
So I have the website now too late. But what's your focus? What's your specialty? What's your
I specialize in Hellenistic astrology, which is the original type of astrology that was invented 2,000 years ago, because Western astrology, it wasn't just something that developed gradually, but instead it was probably invented in a very short span of time in the first century. And my focus is on recovering what the original system of astrology was 2,000 years ago, and then merging some of that with modern astrology and some of the techniques that we use today. So that's my specialization.
And when you give a lecture about free will, choice, and determine, you make reference that you were studying something, and that was kind of skewing you to predetermine. Like, what was that?
There's some techniques in Hellenistic astrology called Time Lord techniques that will divide a person's entire life up into chapters and subsections as if the life was a biography and you were reading it in retrospect. And it was telling you when a person would hit the high point in their career or when they would hit the high point in relationships for 10 or 20-year increments of time. And some of those techniques that we're just now recovering from these ancient texts seem to be much more oriented towards prediction, and they seem to be much more accurate than I would think they would be if everything was just completely free will all the time. They seem to imply that things are predetermined a lot more than we would otherwise think. But that's from Hellenistic astrology, and that's what I teach. I should pitch that. So, because Lisa always yells at me when I forget to pitch my course at the end. If anyone wants to learn more about Hellenistic astrology and my approach, then you can visit my website at chrisbrennan.astrologer.com. And I'm actually recording 2 new lectures on those time word techniques this month for my online course in Hellenistic astrology. And then hopefully we'll be able to do a workshop on them here sometime in the not too distant future. I've been promising to for a while, but we just haven't done it yet. Yeah. Did you have another question?
I make me wonder, is there a major religion that accepts astrology?
Yeah, I mean, Hinduism seems to be one of the ones that's the most open to it over the past 2,000 years. So of the major religions that do accept astrology, that's probably the biggest. I can't think of any others that are as open to astrology or that have incorporated it as such a core part of their doctrine than Hinduism. And then concepts of like karma and reincarnation can get integrated into that. Although, interestingly, not as much, not in the way that we would think that they do, because some of the developments like of attributing past lives and future lives to the nodes that we do in modern Western astrology and evolutionary astrology in particular, they don't necessarily do that in Indian astrology, which is interesting since some of those concepts of karma and reincarnation are sort of originated there.
I was going to say that that question, depending on your definition of religion, the Western mystery tradition or Western music tradition tends to utilize quite a bit of astrology and timing of rituals and magical acts, as well as psychological astrology and a number of other things. So it's pretty integral to those practices.
Yeah, so there's a lot of occult traditions and a lot of mystery traditions in the West as well as the East that incorporate elements of astrology like Hermeticism or Kabbalah or other sort of esoteric schools.
Yeah, Edgar Casey used to reference astrology aspects in his readings.
Right. Yeah, Edgar Casey and a lot of other metaphysical sort of people or other channelers and stuff. It's definitely been incorporated.
And the Spiritualist Church, they have a history with it too.
Sure. Does anyone have any other questions? All right, great. Well, then I think that's it for this lecture. So thanks everyone for coming. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrology podcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at HellenisticAstrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. And finally, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for iPhone and Android. You can find out more information about that at astrogold.io.